week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, commented, liked, all that kind of stuff. Also a big thank you to both Two Brewers and to Glenora Distillery for retweeting my tweet. That was very much appreciated. And yeah, like I said, without the support of you guys that watch it and the distilleries and what have you, then obviously there wouldn't be an episode of the show. Now, talking of comments, a couple of weeks ago, or it might have even been more, I forget now, somebody put a comment on one of the episodes of the show, basically saying the reason I like your reviews is you don't seem to care about the consequences. And that's not strictly true, it has to be said. I do care about the consequences. I mean, you know, you give something a sort of like a good review or lots of praise, and you know, everybody loves you. You know, they want to buy you a beer or a whiskey, you know, pat you on the back, have your babies, all that kind of stuff. You are the greatest thing since sliced bread. On the other hand, you give something a sort of a bad review or a negative review and what have you, and suddenly you are the Antichrist, and the consequences can be quite unpleasant, quite far-reaching, and you know, as a reviewer, you kind of have to sort of think twice before you actually give something a poor review, and you have to sort of think, well, you know, am I going to accept the consequences? Do I really want to put up with all the fallout just for basically giving something a bad review? And so you're walking a tightrope, you know, you really are, because on the one hand, you know, you want to be honest, you want to give an honest appraisal of the juice that's in the bottle in front of you, and you know, so being honest will occasionally mean that you do give a sort of like a negative opinion or a negative review, along with plenty of positive reviews. So it is difficult, and one does have to sort of think about that. And that kind of leads me to say the usual disclaimer that any comments that I do indeed make on today's episode of the show are purely my own and bear no relevance or resemblance to those of my employer. And it leads me nicely into this week's episode of the show. You're probably wondering what I'm talking about, but as you can see, today's episode of the show, it features Longrow. And I think it's the first time I've actually managed to get enough Longrow samples together to do an episode of the show. Normally they kind of appear in with, you know, other Springbank releases and what have you. And the point I'm trying to make is that sort of not so long ago when last year in actual fact, when the Longrow 21 was released by the distillery, I wasn't really that enamoured by it in actual fact. It was a bit hard, it was sulphurous, it was a bit and I gave it a poor review, as you may well remember, and I was not the only one that felt that way. Partially I think it was because, you know, it was the oldest age statement of Longrow that I'd ever had the opportunity to taste, and was really, really looking forward to it, and possibly that hype, I guess, made the disappointment the more pronounced, I suppose. So yes, I gave it a poor review. Did I have a telephone call from Headley Wright calling me every nasty under the sun? No. Did I get a snotty email from Grant saying I'm not going to send you any more samples? No. Did I have luminaries such as John McDougall or sort of others from the distilleries past turning up on my doorstep wanting to break my kneecaps? No, it didn't happen. And I think the reason why is that sort of Springbank has been in this game for an awful long time. They realise that every now and again you're going to get a poor review. It is a fact of life. And you know, they shrug it off, because the reality is it had probably had absolutely no bearing at all on sales, really, at the end of the day. You guys are sort of like more than happy to sort of like buy anything that Springbank releases and make your own mind up, which is brilliant. That's how it should be. And what I say, really, at the end of the day, is going to have very little effect on whether you decide to buy something or not. I mean, with regards to Springbank, that is. I mean, with other things, maybe I have a little bit more influence, I'd like to think. But anyway, with regards to Springbank, it makes no difference at all what I'm going to say, because you're going to buy it anyway. So that's why there was no big fuss, no hoo-ha, no anything at all about a few people such as myself saying that they didn't think the Longrow 21 was that great at bottling. But then again, like I said, there was a number of you that really liked it, you know. But then, you know, there's a number of you that like your Springbank really dirty. So, you know, I kind of rest my case. But anyway, so yeah, I don't think there's an awful lot else to say about Springbank. You know, it's double distilled. You know, it's relatively heavily peated, you know the score. So I'm just gonna introduce the lineup. Right, okay, we're going to kick off with what I think is a criminally overlooked bottling of Longrow. It is the No Age Statement bottling of Longrow. You know, the social media seems to be absolutely chock full of people sort of like posting pictures of ridiculously aged Springbanks and Longrows and single casks, and oh look, it's the single cask bottling out of Mongolia that I managed to get hold of, you know. Does anybody ever post pictures of the No Age Statement Longrow? No, they don't. Criminally overlooked, in my personal opinion. So this is bottled, so it's No Age Statement, bottled 46%. This is a bottling from January of this year. It has the code of 2104 if you really need that information, and I think it's going to be a sort of a good starting point to explore just what Longrow is all about. A bit of an age statement jump now, I must admit, to the second bottling. This is a Longrow 18-year-old. This is a 2019 release, bottle of 46%, and it was comprised of 75% sherry and 25% bourbon. Before I go on, I would just like to say a big thank you to Grant at the distillery, and to my good friends Andy Holbrook and Ian Sunderland for the samples for today's episode of the show. Thank you very much for those. The next bottle we'll be looking at is another 18-year-old, but this is the 2020 release, and slightly different cask makeup, so hopefully, you know, we'll see that difference between the two. This time 55% sherry, 25% bourbon and 2% rum, so yeah, could be interesting. Right, on to the 21. This is the 2020 release of the Longrow 21. This is 5% bourbon and 95% sherry. So let's hope there's no sulphury notes in this one. Last year's, just for reference, I guess, last year's, or the 2019 release, or the year before I should say, in actual fact, was 40% bourbon and 60% sherry. But it's not about how much sherry, it's how clean is your sherry at the end of the day, isn't it? And then we're going to move on to two of the wine finished ones. This is the Virtual Open Day 2020 bottling. It was a 10-year-old, bottled of 53.7%, and it was comprised of two 13-year-old ex-Pinot Noir casks and two 10-year-old refill Malbec casks. So could be interesting. You know, Longrow handles wine pretty well, and on to the last bottling, which is the Longrow Red. Now, I had hoped to have the current or the last release, but unfortunately Grant hasn't managed to get the samples out to me as yet. So you're going to have to make do with the previous bottling. This was the 13-year-old, bottle of 51.6%, which spent 10 years in bourbon and sherry before being finished for 3 years in ex-Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon casks from the Vintergata estate. I think it's got a, well, I don't know, that sounds about right to me anyway. So yeah, this was released February last year, I think, or early last year anyway. So I think this is going to be a really interesting tasting. It's the first time I've done an entire episode of the show, like I said, on Longrow, and yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Right, Okay, so let's kick off with the No Age Statement bottling. Let's see what this gives us. Young, briny, earthy, quite phenolic. Fish oils, coffee, barley, salt. Got quite a nice freshness to it in actual fact. Not as oily as some of the bottlings can be. And I like the freshness. I like the intensity of the No Age Statement bottling. And for those of you who can remember, cast your mind back a few years to the range when they had the CV range, the Springbank, Longrow and Hazelburn CV. And again, of all of the three, I thought the Longrow CV was possibly the one that kind of worked the best. It just seemed to get away with being bottled at a relatively young age. Springbank can be a little bit like, what was the term that what's his face used? Bambi on ice, which it can be. I mean, it's a bit more consistent now than what it used to be. But I've always thought that Longrow, maybe it's the peat, can just get away with being bottled that sort of a little bit earlier. I mean, it's got a lovely complexity. There's a touch of wood notes, there's a touch of tar, and there's some fruit as well. So I think all round that's just a lovely nose. It's really very, very nice, and it's still really quite affordable as well. Let's see what the pal's like. I love that intensity. Fishy, briny, mouth-watering, juicy, underlying fruit there. A little bit of dried fruit, plenty of soot, bit of tar, bit of barley, slight violetiness as well. I mean, what more do you want? I mean, I mean, yes, we'll hopefully discover that Longrow is really quite impressive once it gets a bit of age under its belt. But you know what? I think bang for your buck, that is criminally overlooked. I mean, it really is at the end of the day. And I think I urge you all to go back to the No Age Statement Longrow and just see what you're missing. Right, okay, so let's move on to the first of the two 18-year-olds. So this is the 2019 release, 75% sherry, 25% bourbon. Let's see what those goes. Really oily, thick, briny, really dense and a little unyielding to start off with, that has to be said. It's got some lovely maturity. It's got that sort of slight cognac-esque dried fruit character. There is a slight sulphur note, and I guess part of it is probably me, the fact that I do pick up on sulphur quite readily, which is probably as much as sort of a blessing as it is anything else, I guess. But it's not. It's kind of where it's contained, all right. It's not like it's a stinking sulphury mess. It's, you know, I like it. It's balanced. It's really balanced. I mean, although it's 75% of this has been matured in ex-sherry, it's not a monster. There is a little bit of citrus. There's some herbal peat, some violets, a touch of coffee, wood spice, vanilla, mature American oak notes. Really, really well balanced. And you know, I must admit that I do find some of the really heavily sherried Springbanks to be a little bit of a sort of like a turn off at the end of the day because of the one dimensionality of them, whereas, you know, I'm guessing that the bulk of the sherry casks that we used in this bottling will probably refill given the balance. Anyway, let's see what it passes like. Again, lovely maturity, that cognac-esque dried fruits, dried apple, some lovely violety, dusty peat, a little bit of herbal peat as well, coffee, tar, licorice, really quite weighty, oily, but again it has a lovely salty balance to it. There's even a slight honeyed note kind of coming through. It's really complex, it's balanced, and I guess part of the reason that you know I loved the 18-year-old, which is, you know, why I was so disappointed by the 21, because the 18 can be absolutely gorgeous, and this is lovely. Yeah, really long, lovely peaty character. It's not a peat monster, but there's a good level of peat there, and it's got, like I say, it's got that combination of earthiness and dustiness, and there's a little violety note coming through as well, which I often tend to find in older Springbanks, and that's really quite impressive. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 2020 release. So sherry, bourbon and rum. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? A lot subtler than the previous bottling. I'm getting more mature American oak. There's a little bit of dried fruit, brine, earth. And the sherry, although not as intense, is giving me a little bit more raisinated fruit, so it's not quite so cognac-y in actual fact, or coffeed. It's a really quite a different beast. It's not as peated either. The peat is a lot subtler, it's a lot sort of more delicate in actual fact. It's more of a wisp of smoky peat rather than sort of briny, tarry peat. I'd almost go as far as saying this is actually quite elegant. It's sort of reserved. It's you know, it is very different, and it's obviously, I guess maybe the initial spirit, maybe it's lost a bit more peat than the previous bottling. Maybe it's the rum cask that's just kind of taking the edge off the intensity and just giving it a little bit more of an oiliness possibly, but it is very different, it has to be said. Let's see what Pat's like. Soft, slightly gritty, slightly tannic, subtler peat again, but it's got that lovely earthiness to it. I'm getting more mature American oak. The sherry is, again, like on the nose, it was more giving me more raisinated fruit, but again very, very subtle. Fish oil, spice, a little bit of coffee, a little bit of tannin. I like that. That's a lovely, lovely nose and palate. I think of the two, that is certainly my preference, because even though that it's still got a fair amount of sherry there, I'm getting more American oak character. The sherry is dialed down a bit, and it's just adding nuances, which is what I want from, you know, these kind of sherry casks. Yeah, I like that. That's impressive. I think both bottlings are very, very impressive. Both bottlings completely different, but I'm just kind of preferring this one. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Longrow 21. So this is the 2020 release. Let's see what the nose gives us. Right, first off, no sulphur. I mean, that's right. You know, we're off to a flyer here, guys. Again, quite oily, but it's got a real saltiness, more freshness. We're almost kind of like got the... it's almost got the salty freshness of the No Age Statement bottling, which is really impressive. The peat is a lot subtler than it is in the 18. It's now more of a wisp of violety, slightly sort of earthy wisp. Again, plenty of mature American oak, apricot, barley. There's a little bit of, I mean, considering this is 95% sherry, I mean, I would not have guessed that at all. I would have said 5%. I mean, it really is very, very light on the sherry. Yes, you're getting the raisinated fruit notes in the background, but considering, like I said, that this is, you know, 95% of this has been matured in sherry casks, you wouldn't have thought it. And I like this. I think this is really impressive. I think a lot of people have, certainly I read comments that they weren't quite particularly impressed by this bottling, and maybe their judgment was clouded by the previous year's bottling. But you know what? I don't think this is a bad bottling at all. It's a lot subtler than the 18-year-old. It certainly is not sort of whacking me in the face. It's yeah. Let's see what the pal's like. Considerable improvement on the previous year's bottling. No sulphur at all. In actual fact, again, I'm getting more American oak, buttery, mature American oak, dusty peat. Like I say, this is sort of an echo of peat rather than sort of like a, you know, full-on sort of peat briquette experience. Plenty of salt, apricot, barley, little dried, almost tropical fruit note kind of just coming through there. You know, I'm getting a little bit of almost pineapple, but the peat lingers. The peat is elegant, it's sort of smoky, but it just keeps lingering and keeps going throughout the entire palate, and it is really well balanced in my personal opinion. And like I said, although it is really heavy in inverted commas on the sherry on paper, in reality it's not at all, and it is, you know, rather good. Right, okay, so let's move on to the first of the two wine influenced Longrows. Let's see what those goes on this end, shall we? it's winey Longrow. It's robust, it's intense, it's in your face, it's edgy, herbal, red-black fruits, gritty peat. I don't know what it is about wine, but it really brings out the grittiness of Springbank, and it's obviously the tannins. It's the way the tannins are interacting with the spirit. There's a little bit of a syrupy sweetness to the fruit. It's a little bit on the rough side, but it's kind of like rough in a good way. You know, it's kind of natural. It's untamed. It's in your face. It's essentially what Longrow in a wine cask should be, in my personal opinion. I mean, you know, a number of you may well remember that 7-year-old Gaia Barolo finished Longrow, which was kind of like an absolute car crash. I mean, it really was, but it was kind of like, you know, strangely appealing because of it, you know. And I'll always remember that. It's just one of those whiskies that will forever, forever be imprinted on my brain, it has to be said. Yeah, this is, yeah, it's lovely, it's intense, it's, like I say, it's a bit raw, it's a bit sort of in your face, but, you know, this is, I guess, what you want from wine cask Longrow at the end of the day, isn't it? Let's see what that's like. Again, raw, winey, little butricness, which again kind of works quite nicely. I mean, it's not sort of like an overt note, it's just a sort of like it's whole part of the package at the end of the day, I suppose. There's black fruit, there's red currant, there's herbal wood notes, there's peat. It's a little bit masked on the finish, and I don't quite have enough to put a little drop of water with. Fruit, winey fruit, char, intense, I mean, it's what you want from wine cask Longrow at the end of the day, you know. From older age statement Longrow, I want that sort of like maturity. I want that sort of slight elegance, you know. For me, you know, when I'm having a wine cask Longrow, you know, I want it to sort of like, you know, rip my head off basically, you know. And although it's not completely doing that, it has to be said, it has that untamed rawness to it, which I'm quite happy with. I think it's great. Okay, and let's finish off with the Longrow Red 13-year-old. So, like I said, 10 years in bourbon and sherry, and 3 years finishing in ex-Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon casks. See what those goes. Now, everything I just basically said about the previous wine cask Longrow, it just doesn't happen here. It's quite subtle in actual fact. It's quite almost elegant for a winey Longrow. A little bit of menthol, black pepper, black currant, red fruits, peat, fish oil. You know, it's kind of, like I said, I mean, it's almost elegant by Longrow Red standards, which is, and there's been a number of them that have been more and greater than the rawness of the previous bottling. So yeah, I mean, this is amazing. Like I said, this is actually quite civilised by Longrow Red standards, which is a good thing. Sure, pass on. Again, pretty elegant, really. It's the peat is quite dusty. It's building quite nicely. It starts off quite subtly, but the gritty tannins kind of come in. Again, it has that sort of very natural kind of feel to it. Red, black fruits, fish oils, earth, a little bit of menthol. But again, it's got a, like I say, it's got a natural kind of character, but it's actually got quite a sort of an almost polished kind of character. And like I said, it doesn't quite have the rawness of the open day bottling or some of the previous bottlings of the Longrow Red. And so, you know, in actual fact, I have to say it's actually pretty elegant by Longrow Red standards, which is a bit of a shock, because it's not what you would normally expect from that particular bottling. But, you know, either way, I mean, it's still a lovely whiskey. And, you know, I think it's impressive. And this is the lovely thing about whiskies. You can have a certain sort of preconception, shall we say, and then you taste it and suddenly that preconception just kind of like gets blown out of the water, and certainly in that case it definitely does. So yeah, that was good. Okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, like I said, again, big thank you to Grant at the distillery, to my good friends Ian Sunderland, and to Andy Holbrook. Almost forgot your name there, Andy, sorry. I just had a bit too much Longrow. Yeah, a big thank you. And like I said, you know, if you want me to review a specific whiskey that you have, you want my opinion of it, then, you know, feel free to either stick it in the post or drop it into the shop, you know, and I'm more than happy to do an episode. So today's episode, like I say, Longrow No Age Statement, criminally overlooked. You know, you guys go on and on and on about the 18, the 21-year-old, the single cask, yada yada yada, and I think sometimes you just kind of forget about the slightly more simpler pleasures in life. And yeah, I think the Longrow No Age Statement really does deliver. It is not a bad bottling whatsoever. And like I said, I think you overlook it at your own peril. The 2019 18-year-old, yeah, I mean, beautiful whiskey, it has to be said. You know, considering the amount of sherry casks that were being used in the blend, it's actually pretty balanced, and it has that lovely kind of cognac-esque kind of mature rancio going on, which I really liked. The 2020 bottling, which I think just kind of edged it for me. And a little bit less sherry, a little bit more American oak character coming through. Had that sort of subtle oiliness, which I'm guessing is probably being derived from the rum casks. So yeah, I'm more than happy with that. I think both equally great bottlings. My preference slightly for the 2020 release. The Longrow 21. I mean, you know, I like that. I thought that was really impressive. It said to me what I wanted to hear from a 21-year-old Longrow. It had a delicacy of peat character. There was no off notes. There was no kind of sulphur blemishes. There was nothing to detract from. In actual fact, quite an elegant character, it has to be said. It certainly had a lovely freshness. It had a saltiness, and it had that sort of, you know, link to the No Age Statement release in that respect. And you know. Yeah, I thought that was a pretty good bottling, and maybe it was because 2019 was a bit of a stinker. That's what makes that feel even better. I don't know. The open day bottling, well, you know, if you were fortunate enough to get hold of a bottle of that, then that was a great whiskey. I mean, that just basically said classic wine influenced Longrow. It was a bit, well, I wouldn't quite say rough and ready. It was a bit raw, natural. That's a good word to use, natural. And it's just basically what you want from, you know, a wine finished Longrow. Whereas the 13-year-old Cabernet Sauvignon finish was what an unexpected twist. Dare I say it had some more elegance than your usual Longrow Red bottling, which is a bit of a treat, it has to be said. And this is it, you always want a bit of a curveball, you know, you don't want the same thing over and over again. So so yeah, I think this has been a really intriguing tasting. I've certainly enjoyed it. It's like I said, it's the first time that I've had the opportunity to do an entire episode of the show on Longrow, and like I said, No Age Statement Longrow, criminally overlooked. So get hold of a bottle, that's all I can say. From any good retailer, I should hasten to add. Until next week, good dramming and good afternoon.